In this session we are thinking about progression in early reading, specifically in the area of word recognition, and we'll be looking at the use of systematic synthetic phonics in relation to word recognition. We need to remember that in the simple view of reading, reading is considered as a combination of language comprehension and word recognition, and it is only through a combination of those that a child can become a comprehending reader. So that when we are talking about a child recognizing words, that is to say they are able to say the words in front of them in a text, we cannot say that they are reading. We can simply say that they are able to recognize the words. Reading itself, the act of being a reader, requires comprehension as well. However, in this session we are looking specifically at word recognition. According to the Department for Education, any program of phonics that is high quality should demonstrate the following: that children have a clearly defined incremental sequence of grapheme-phoneme correspondences, that they learn to apply the highly important skills of blending phonemes and apply the skills of segmenting words into their constituent phonemes. So blending phonemes, k, at, we have cat. Segmenting words into their phonemes, we have the word cat, we segment it, k, at. And that children are able to understand that these are reversible processes. Jolliffe and Waugh have taken these statements and have pulled them apart a little more. Take a moment to read this slide before going on to the next one, as this will make it far more explicit. Ehri's model of reading development is very influential in helping people understand how children's reading develops. And if we see, it starts here with a pre-alphabetic phase where children read by looking at visual cues. So the example given here is they might read a word as Pepsi despite the fact it has a letter X at the front, because visually it's within Pepsi's own distinctive logo, so the child recognizes that and they have a word associated with that visual image, even though they don't know what the letters mean in terms of having sounds that correspond to those letters. When we're teaching phonics, we are thinking about these partial alphabetic phases and full alphabetic phases in particular, and moving from one to the other. So through phonics we enable children to develop their letter sound information. And as children are reading, if you look at the examples here, reading tin as toy, reading jail as jewel, you can see that a child would be drawing partially on their letter sound information. They're drawing on that, but they haven't got all the necessary components in order to read word recognize accurately. Whereas when they have the full alphabetic phase, which we're taking them towards through the process of systematic synthetic phonics, they're able to say aloud an unfamiliar word. So the word dog, they can convert that into sounds. D-og, dog. So there is a sequential process here. The child moving from a pre-alphabetic phase where they're just seeing images to a partial alphabetic phase where they realize that letters have sounds associated but they're not secure on connecting one to the other, and then a full alphabetic phase. There is this final stage, the consolidated alphabetic phase, where the child recognizes large elements such as morphemes. Now, morphemes, remember, are the smallest unit of meaning in a language. So if you look at the example here, we have dance and danced, and dance is one unit of meaning, and the ed is another unit of meaning, because it tells us that they danced. And when these are joined together, it changes the nature of the word. So dance is modified by adding an ed on the end. Some people don't see this as part of phonics, but it clearly fits within phonics programs. and it is a necessary part of children's reading development. Going back to the Department for Education's expectations for high quality synthetic phonics, these are the tests that they give any program that they wish to approve. And the list currently, that is to say 2017, the current list is Letters and Sounds, which is a government publication itself, and then you have Floppy Phonics, Jolly Phonics, Letterland, Phonics Bug, Phonics International, Read Write Inc., Sound Discovery, Sounds Right, and the Tap Tap Bat system. You may find any one of these in a school in which you're working, or the school may have designed their own phonics program. We will be using Letters and Sounds as our model, and some schools have built their phonics program on Letters and Sounds or combined Letters and Sounds with other programs. The other most popular ones that you may come across would be Read Write Inc., Phonics International, and Jolly Phonics. And a lot of you may be in schools where you do the actions that go with the sounds, like here the ants on my arm, and you have an action to go with that. But you have to understand that even if you go to 2 schools during your school experiences that use the same phonics program, that does not mean every school does the same. These are very specific phonics programs that schools are following, and it is up to the school which one they choose. As I said, we're going to use Letters and Sounds. Now, if you're using a different phonics program in a school, the order in which sounds are presented may be slightly different. The way things are done may be slightly different. But hopefully by following the letters and analysing the Letters and Sounds progression here, you will see a way that you can approach understanding how children progress through a phonics program with which you're working. There shouldn't be huge differences, but there may be small shifts. Letters and Sounds is organised into 6 phases, and what I've tried to do in this presentation is to stick to the colour coordination that's used in the publication itself. So through all the slides you will see the colours that match those in the book, and of course if you wish you can download the Letters and Sounds book from the internet and have that alongside to read alongside this presentation. So we move from phase 1 to phase 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 obviously, but phase 1 and phase 6 sort of stand alone because they are a bit different from the others. The main space within which we see progression is within phase 2, 3, 4, 5. Phase 6 is we start looking at the morphology, which is that last point that was made, and phase 1, well, we will explain phase 1 in a moment. If you look at the notes and guidance for practitioners and teachers for Letters and Sounds, that's also available as a download, you will see in the back on page 28 there is this table, and this PowerPoint uses this table as a basis for this explanation, but I have augmented what is there, drawing in much more detail on what's through the program. In this presentation we're going to cover progression in these areas: phonological and phonemic awareness, oral segmenting and blending, and then knowledge of grapheme-phoneme correspondences. Remember that acronym GPCs, it's very important. Then blending and segmenting from written text, which is a development from oral segmenting and blending. Then we're going to look at high-frequency words. We're going to look at high-frequency words containing regular GPCs and also those which are common exception words, and we'll explain what high-frequency words are at that point, and then we'll look at morphology at the end. So phase 1, it stands separate really from phases 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6 in Letters and Sounds, and if you take a moment to read this slide and then click to move on. So in the first paragraph, it says phase one paves the way for systematic teaching of phonic work to begin in phase two. But if you look at the final lines there, it says phase one activities are designed to underpin and run alongside activities in other phases. So although you may start with phase one teaching and learning, those activities should run through every other phase. The development of phonological and phonemic awareness should be part of what you are doing throughout your phonics program. Jolliffe and Waugh define these two terms, phonological awareness and phonemic awareness, in these ways. Phonological awareness, the ability to perceive, recall and manipulate sounds, and phonemic awareness, the ability to perceive and manipulate the phonemes in a spoken word and to remember the order of phonemes in words. So the second one is a development of the first. It's far more specific. Some people, when they're talking about phonological awareness, will be talking about the ability to hear those phonemes as well. But the phonemic awareness is the actually being able to recognize and identify them in words. And in letters and sounds, this is done through environmental sounds, instrumental, so playing with musical instruments, body percussion, rhythm and rhyme, use of nursery rhyme, alliteration, using voice sounds, making lots of different sounds with the mouth, so you're feeling what sounds come from your mouth when you put your tongue and your lips and you may in particular positions, and oral blending and segmenting. The development of phonological awareness is not without its critique. The letters and sounds approach is based on the assertion that you should be teaching phonological awareness as a discrete area, apart from everything else. You should be doing exercises that develop children's phonological awareness. Now, whilst there is no one that I have read who will say that's wrong, if you look at the second paragraph here from Johnson and Watson's book Teaching Synthetic Phonics, they say that their position is that there is no clear evidence that the teaching of phonological awareness in isolation from printed text has any impact on children's reading development. That's a summary of their statement. It's not actually a direct quote. So that statement above, that it should remember that phase one activities are designed to underpin and run alongside activities in other phases, does sit very well with that research conclusion that actually doing phonological awareness activities without any reference to print doesn't actually make much difference according to the research. Doing those activities with activities that are related to print does have impact. So going back to the idea of segmenting and blending, oral segmenting and blending is a fundamental part of this stage in the teaching and learning of systematic synthetic phonics. So we say a word, dog. We segment a word orally to identify the phonemes, d, o, g. We sound them out individually, d, o, g. And then we take those phonemes, d, o, g, and we blend them together, d, o, g, dog. We hear or discern the word. No reference to printed text at that point when we're doing that oral. When we have textual blending and segmenting, that's a development from this. So that's the first stage, that oral segmenting and blending, where you move from spoken word to spoken sounds to spoken word again. Nursery rhymes are also a vital part of this process, that children are developing their understanding of sound, of phonemes through playing with rhyme. To know that dog rhymes with log, rhymes with bog, means that a child is beginning to understand how to segment, because they know that the d sound is separate from the og, the l is separate from og, the b is separate from og. So playing with nursery rhymes, teaching nursery rhymes is not a luxury. It's a vital part of children hearing language and learning those sounds, and also hearing the rhythms of English language as well. So moving on now from phase 1 to phase 2, and we move from phase 2, 3, 4 and 5, we see a development in how children are exposed to the different grapheme phoneme correspondences. The first thing children are going to do is to learn the letters of the alphabet, or at least learn some letters of the alphabet and the sounds that are associated with them. So you'll see in phase 2 they learn 19 letters, and phase 3 they learn 7 letters. For the first 6 weeks they are just learning those letters and a single sound that is associated with them. So in phase 2 it'd be s, a, t, p, I, n, m, d, g, o, k, k, e, a, r, l, h, b, f. In phase 3, j, v, w, x, y, z. Not only do children learn those individual letters and the sounds, they also learn common consonant digraphs, because they'll need these to be able to read quite simple words. So they'll learn that CK makes K, double F is F, double L is OOL, double S is S. When they're in phase 3, they'll learn double Z, QU, CH, SH, TH, NG, AI, double E, IGH, OA and double O. You're building children's repertoire of grapheme phoneme correspondences and expanding the number of simple words that they can read and that they can write. Because remember, when they read, they are blending these sounds together. When they're writing, they're segmenting words. If you look at phase 4, which comes after 18 weeks, the children have been learning these things after 18 weeks, and then they have 4 to 6 weeks where they simply consolidate what they have learned. So we are introducing new sounds every week for 18 weeks, new grapheme phoneme correspondences, sound letter correspondences for 18 weeks, and then they have 4 to 6 weeks where they simply can consolidate that learning and practice it and put it into different contexts. Then, in phase 5, they are introduced to alternative ways of pronouncing. So they might have learned OW, but now they're going to learn that it can be cow, it can be ow, or it can be blow, O. EA can be eat, E, or it can be bread, E. They're also going to learn that you can have other graphemes for the same sound. So you can have other ways of spelling the same sound. So they have already learned AI in phase 3 as A. Now they're going to learn AY. And hopefully this is bringing you back to the 4 key principles of phonics. That sounds can be represented by letters, they can be represented by more than one letter, that a single sound can be represented in different ways, and that a single grapheme can be pronounced in different ways. And so children are being introduced into these incrementally. Looking at phase 5 and that notion that we're taught that there are different graphemes for the same phoneme and that the same grapheme can be pronounced in different ways there, so that OW can be OW or O. If you look at phase 6, then children are learning how to spell words how to spell graphemes in particular contexts. So if you look at the example there, C and C, that they're attaching a particular grapheme to a particular meaning. So when I see you on the other side of the road, that I know that that is double E. When I go to play in the C, I know that that is spelled EA. Now phase 6 goes throughout year 2, and in fact should carry on beyond year 2. We're now going to think about blending and segmenting. So just as a quick revision, we've looked at the idea of oral blending. Now we're thinking about textual. So we're seeing words, we're seeing letters. How are we going to blend? We scan through the word from left to right. As we see the graphemes, we say those sounds in automatic response. So we see the letters C-A-T, and we say the graphemes, as we say the phonemes, the sounds, in response to those graphemes. We see C-A-T and we say k-at. And then we blend those together. K-at, cat. And we can hear or discern the word. So we are starting with the written word, and from that we are moving to the spoken word. Remember, blending and segmenting is reversible. So when we're segmenting, we start with the spoken word. So we say the word slowly and segment it to identify the sounds, the phonemes. Cat, cat. We identify the sounds. K, a, t. And we decide what are the appropriate graphemes for the sounds, which goes back to that knowing the context that we're using for words like C and C. But let's simply work with cat. So the most obvious k sound in English at the beginning of a word is the most obvious way to spell that is with a C. A is quite often an A, it's most often an A, and t is most often a T, and so we can spell it, and we write that down. So we are starting with the spoken word cat, and we end up with the written word C-A-T. Remember, we use sounds, we use the phonemes k-at when we are talking about reading, we use the letters C-A-T when we are talking about spelling. To see how there's progression in the skills of blending and segmenting, it helps to look at the examples on this page here. So let's look at phase 2, and it says segment whole words into separate sounds for spelling. So if I say the word in, then we segment it in. We segment up, up, and you can see how these words are using the individual letters of the alphabet with the single sounds associated with them. Above it says blend separate sounds together into whole words. So you'd be reversing one from the other. We are reading the word sit, s-it, sit, and then we're using that word for writing. We're spelling it, sit. We segment it, s-it, and write the letters S-I-T. If you look at phase 3, we're blending and segmenting those single letters and graphemes of more than one letter. So if you remember, CH was introduced in phase 3 when we were looking at the introduction of grapheme phoneme correspondences. So now the child has got correspondences for the letter I, the letter P, and the letters CH. So now that child can read the word chip, ch-ip, and they can also write that word chip. We segment it, ch-ip, and we allocate the digraph CH and the grapheme I and the grapheme P. So you can see now how that is more complex than the previous phase. We're also going to look at two-syllable words as well. So words like bedroom, bedroom is 2 syllables, and we can read that b-ed and then r-u-m. And if we're going to spell it, to write it, we'd say bedroom. It's 2 syllables, bedroom. The first syllable is bed, which we can spell by segmenting b-ed, which will give us B-E-D, and then the second syllable is room, and we segment it into sounds. We get r-u-m, and we know r is a letter R, and that last sound m is a letter M, and we've learnt that digraph double O for oo. In phase 4, we're looking at adjacent consonants, which is something that a lot of people struggle with. So if you look at the word frog, frog, hearing that there is a difference between those 2 consonant sounds, f, r, precede the OG, the OG, is quite tricky. And you need to think about what your mouth is doing, the shapes it is making, which manipulate the sounds. Remember, consonants is where you block the air, so that f is where your teeth come to your lips, your tongue is going to the back of your mouth. There are very clearly two different shapes there, two different sounds. So being able to identify those sounds is very important for not only reading but also for spelling. So blending and segmenting those adjacent consonants, that's a big important shift there. In phase 5, all of the grapheme-phoneme correspondences that have been learnt so far, children try reading and spelling using them, blending and segmenting. And when they're reading, if they see a word such as COW and read it as co, as in bow, OW as O, they have to think, does that sound right within the context, which links it also to comprehension, that you're understanding, does that make sense within the context within which you're using it? No, then the pronunciation must be wrong. And in phase 6, it's about fluency and being able to tackle words that you've never seen before or never spelt before, using those phonic rules that we've learnt, those grapheme-phoneme correspondences, and making what are termed phonetically plausible attempts at spelling. So we say a word we're unfamiliar with, we have a go using the knowledge that we have. We're now going to come on to high-frequency word, and if you look in the main text for letters and sounds on page 193 and thereafter, you will find some lists of high-frequency words. These are created from surveys of children's literature to find out which are the words that occur most often when children are reading, and unsurprisingly, number 1 is the, and number 2 is and. The problem is that a lot of these high-frequency words are not instantly word recognizable because they are not regular. You cannot use your phonics to say them aloud or to spell them. However, some are. In order to read fluently, you need to be able to develop automaticity. You shouldn't be sitting sounding out the letters of the graphemes of every word that you read. So developing automaticity means that those high frequency words that keep coming up, children should just be able to see and recognize. Now, the ones that, as I say, some of them are actually regular, which means we can use our phonic rules. So here is a list moving from phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, phase 5, phase 6. You will notice something if you look at the bottom of phase 2 here, that it says put for northern accents. Well, if you then look in phase 5, you have put for southern accents. Well, if I say the word mum and but, then if we look at the word put, if the word put was phonemically regular, was decodable using your phonics, then it would be put, like golf. But if you have a northern accent, that you may say mum, but, put, so actually they all sound the same. It's only in southern English accents that you find that it actually changes, the vowel sound changes. So you have to be sensitive to the accent that the children are using as to whether a word is regular or not when you are trying to either spell it or to read it. An important point is what it says here in phase 5, that some words which were tricky earlier are no longer tricky. Any word that a child struggles to read because they do not have the necessary grapheme-phoneme correspondences is tricky until they have them. Once you know the rules, then you can read, where you can recognize the words and then comprehend. But if you don't have those grapheme-phoneme correspondences, it's tricky. So in phase 1, you have quite a limited range of grapheme-phoneme correspondences on which you can draw if a child is going to be able to recognize every word that they read and spell every word that they use. And obviously, as we progress, they become familiar with more and more grapheme-phoneme correspondences, fewer words become tricky for them. I want to disagree with 4 of the words that they got here, because under phonemically regular high-frequency words that are in letters and sounds, they have got as, is, of, and his. Now, as, is, and his all end in a z sound. If they were phonemically regular, it would be as, is, and his. And of would be off, because it's o-ev, o-f, and when children are in phase 2, then they will have only learnt the f sound for f, so they would be reading off. So I think this is an error, so it's something to watch out for, to check. Don't just assume that when you've read something is phonemically regular that it is. Actually think for yourself what happens when you say these words, what happens when you read them. When children have not learnt the rules that they need, or that the words that use grapheme-phoneme correspondences that are not regular, they're exceptional words, then children have got to learn just to recognize them and just to be able to write them. So, for instance, the word the, which, as we've already seen, is the highest frequency word. Children will learn the word the in phase 2. At the beginning of their phonics learning, they will learn the. There is no point in trying to segment the word the before you spell it, because if you segment it, you get t, h, e. And trying to spell the from the sounds t, h, e is pointless. It doesn't work. You simply have to learn that the is spelled T-H-E. And if we then go down to bottom of phase 5 and look at the word eyes, you simply have to learn that eyes is spelled E-Y-E-S. You've got E-Y-E for the I, and the S makes that Z sound again. Eyes, not ice. Finally, we come to the issue of morphology, or not issue, but the area of morphology, which means learning about suffixes and prefixes, which we call together affixes. So learning about affixes and the root words to which they're attached, and the spelling rules. The spelling rules for prefixes are easy because nothing changes. However, when you add a suffix, there are all kinds of rules about how you add a suffix and what happens to the root word. So children have to learn how to add suffixes and prefixes to words. They also have to learn how to spell polysyllabic words. So we take, we've already talked about bedroom, but if we take plastic, polysyllabic, it has more than one syllable. We're breaking it down to plas and tick, which is, plas is a CCVC syllable, and tick is a CVC syllable. And we also need to work on how we spell the sound schwa, which is the sound. So farmer, farmer. We know that the at the end of farmer is an ER. And recognizing the unusual grapheme-phoneme correspondences, such as the GH as an F sound, as in laugh, and how to use dictionaries so that children can use their developing knowledge of grapheme-phoneme correspondences and initial sounds to find the words that they want to spell. Finally, they need to develop their spelling strategies beyond the grapheme-phoneme correspondences, so they need to be able to use syllabics, their understanding of syllables, their understanding of root words and suffixes and prefixes. They also use analogy, so this word sounds like that one, so it may be spelt like that one, and taking chunks of words and fitting those in to help spelling, and mnemonics, using little tricks to remember, like one collar and two sleeves for necessary, one C and two S's. Finally, just a reminder of the Department for Education's expectations for phonics programs and how they have a clearly defined incremental sequence. So whatever phonics program you're using in school, you should be able to look at it and go, I see how it is becoming more complex as we go along. Children are being introduced to grapheme-phony correspondences in stages. They're becoming more complex as they go through the program, and children are developing automaticity. That is the key, that they are developing automaticity for their reading and for their writing. And when they can't spell a word, or when they read a word and they don't understand it, they have strategies for how to deal with that, which could simply be looking in a dictionary. Now, you should complete the online quiz or audit that accompanies this lesson, and if you need any help, then obviously Letters and Sounds is there for you. Go to it and find any information that you need to consolidate your own understanding of how children progress in their understanding, their phonic understanding, as early readers.